listen-only mode.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Sporty's webinar on our spring kind of flying refresher, knocking the rust off for all those who've been kind of away from it for the winter months, or maybe even some of you who have been away from flying several years. My name is Eric Radke. I'm not only your facilitator for the evening, but I also serve as President and Chief Instructor of Sporty's Academy, and I'm also going to be a presenter this evening. Joining me is David Zitt. David serves as Vice President of Flight Education at Sporty's Academy, our on-site flight school down at Sporty's in the Cincinnati, Ohio area, and handles everything aviation training related. David, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Good evening, Eric. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here with these webinars.
Absolutely. So the way we have the presentation planned, I will start things off, and then David's going to pick up about halfway through, so you're going to get to hear some different topics from both of us. So hopefully that will be somewhat entertaining and also just provide a little bit varied perspective for you out there. A few housekeeping items before we get started, and we will get started right away because we have a lot of content to cover in a fairly short amount of time. We are recording tonight's presentation, so if you do have to step away for any reason at all, we will have the full recorded version available to you in just about a day up on our website at sportys.com/webinars. Also, feel free via the webinar software throughout the evening to submit questions, and then we do plan to carve out some time at the very end of our presentation to answer some of those questions. So with that, again, let's get started. I just told you who we were. If, again, at any time you have questions that maybe pop up after the webinar, if you want to jot down the website or even the email address, fly@sportysacademy.com, you can reach either of us. And I will make a quick plug, if you will, for our on-site flight school, Sporty's Academy down in Cincinnati. We'd be happy to have any of you out there listening tonight to our facility, be it for some proficiency training or whether you're finishing up a certificate or rating. We work with clients from all walks of life from all over the globe, quite literally, at our facility, so we'd be very happy to have you contact us anytime. To begin, just so we can learn a little more about who we're speaking to tonight, we do have a quick poll that I'm going to put in the field, and that's going to allow us to just get a little bit, again, better feel of the type of experience or background level that we are dealing with this evening. So I will give just a moment here for the results to come in. And it looks like the majority of you out there are licensed pilots getting back into aviation after some time away, but close to a quarter of you are just looking to knock some rust off. So for that, I will say that's great, because I think we have some good information, some great information, as a matter of fact, to cover all of those backgrounds out there. First and foremost, all of you, no matter how you responded to that poll question right there, you are certainly not alone. We all experience it. I experience it. David experiences it. Staying proficient, continuing with your flying activity, it's hard, quite frankly. And it seems like with each passing day, with each passing year, it gets more difficult and more difficult, because typically we're all taking on more responsibilities, more obligations, be it family, work, other factors that come up in life. Life seems to oftentimes just get in the way. So we are here to kind of provide hopefully a good solid foundation and resources to reestablish that appropriate knowledge base that may allow you to get back into the airplane. And then we also hope towards the end of our presentation to maybe share with you some strategy or some insight for continuing on a proficiency program, because certainly flying is not without risk and shouldn't be taken lightly. So it does demand that you give it its due attention and maintain a basic level of proficiency in order to stay safe out there. And absolutely, of course, would always endorse, if the slightest doubt exists as to your comfort level in the airplane, your proficiency level, always seek out a local flight instructor, even if you're not there for something specific, just to, again, provide an added level of safety. And, you know, certainly we all probably have something more and something new to learn. what we're going to cover a little bit tonight. We're going to talk. We're going to begin and talk a little bit about what it takes to regain your your legal ability to fly PIC again. We're also going to mention a few things that may have changed, especially for those of you who have been away from aviation for several years. And then we're going to prepare you to returning to aviation. And we're going to talk a little airspace. We're going to talk about some regulatory review. And then David is also going to get into some weather and flight planning related information. And then again, as I mentioned, talk more about staying active. First of all, let's dispel maybe a couple of myths or maybe some things or some concerns that have kept you away or prevented you from taking this step a little bit sooner. There is no need, once you are a licensed pilot, to take another FAA check ride. If you take a close look at that FAA pilot certificate that you possess, it does not come with an expiration date. A quick sidebar, if you are taking a look at your pilot certificate, for those of you who may be with us who have been out for an extended period of time, if you still happen, I've seen very few of these, but if you still happen to possess an old style paper certificate, those are no longer valid. Rest easy, that doesn't mean you've lost your pilot privileges, but that does have to be replaced with a new plastic version, which can be done online if you just search replacement airman certificate from the FAA. But we do have new plastic pilot certificates that replace those old paper versions. In addition to not having to take another check ride, there is not another FAA knowledge test you are required to take to get back into aviation. The only time you would be required to take an additional knowledge test if you were going to be adding a rating or upgrading a certificate, say from a private to a commercial. What is going to be required is a flight review. Now, while I'll mention the minimum requirements for a flight review, and the completion of a flight review just requires that a flight instructor endorse your logbook verifying that yes, indeed, you have completed these minimum requirements for a flight review, which is a minimum 1 hour ground instruction and also a minimum 1 hour flight instruction. Now, the actual length and involvement of a flight review is going to be different for every single person listening. It's going to be dependent on how long you've been away. It's going to be dependent on the type of flying that you have done and that perhaps you intend to do. So a flight review, there is no pass-fail. It's nothing to get anxious about. In a flight review situation, you're just training to a specific level of proficiency and a specific comfort level. So you being ready to satisfy the flight review requirement really is just as much a function of how you feel, what your comfort level is, what you're feeling as to your proficiency level, as it is the flight instructor's evaluation. So it very much is a team effort. Please do not go into a flight review situation thinking that it should be high stress or like a check ride scenario. It is certainly not that. Some additional recommendations. If you are stepping back, especially after an extended period, consider some of the many online or video-based training materials that are out there and available online. Certainly Sporty's is a good option, a wonderful option. We have a dedicated flight review program, also an instrument proficiency check program if you're an IFR flyer that can count as your minimum ground requirement for the flight review. If you'd like to brush up on some things ahead of going to seek out a flight instructor. The video-based format makes it very comfortable and relaxed. It allows you to focus on material that you believe maybe are areas of weakness. It allows you to review the material over and over again. It can be used as an ongoing resource for your studies. Regarding carrying passengers, another item in addition to the flight review that will be required if you intend to have passengers with you is that you are, per FAR 6157, probably everyone remembers this, you are required to have completed 3 takeoffs and landings in the same category and class of aircraft that you would be flying in. If you happen to be flying in a tailwheel aircraft, those landings are required to be to a full stop. And also, if you intend to be current to carry passengers at night, you have to have had 3 takeoffs and landings between the time period of 1 hour after sunset to 1 hour before sunrise, and those must also have been to a full stop, and that's for passenger carrying operations only. I want to kind of point out a careful distinction here in terms of the time frame for your night landings to be completed, that 1 hour after sunset to 1 hour before sunrise. This whole interpretation of what night really is and what night really means, it can get a little bit confusing. The FAA has not done us any favors because there's several definitions that you'll see within the regulations, within the Aeronautical Information Manual. There's the requirement to have position lights illuminated between the time period of sunset to sunrise. There's also the quote-unquote legal definition of night for logging purposes, which happens to be the end of evening twilight to the beginning of morning twilight. In this case, for landings, we're specifically talking 1 hour after sunset to 1 hour before sunrise. Renewing your medical could be on your list of to-do items in terms of coming back into aviation, but we have, as you see on this slide, a big maybe there in parentheses, because if you desire to take advantage of sport pilot privileges, so hopefully that's not a new term for you, sport pilot privileges. We'll talk a little bit more about it in just a second. But if you desire to just take advantage of those light sport flying rules where you're going to limit yourself to a passenger, you're going to be flying in a small aircraft, no more than 2-place, single engine in good conditions, you may not be required to possess a medical. If you're strictly going to fly under those sport pilot rules, regardless of whether you're a sport pilot, private pilot, doesn't matter, you can self-certify for your medical fitness for flight. Meaning if you possess a valid driver's license, if you have determined yourself to be capable and able of flying the aircraft, you can take advantage of those sport privileges. Now, if you're going to be flying an aircraft that doesn't fit that sport category, you want to carry more than one passenger, you're going to be flying instruments at night, you want flexibility on altitude, you want to take advantage, in other words, of full-blown, say, private pilot privileges, yes, you are still going to need to renew your medical. One caution note that's pointed out here on the slide: you are not able to self-certify your medical fitness for flight under light sport rules if sometime in the past you've had a medical revoked, denied, or withdrawn. So that is one caveat to the self-certifying medical rules. Speaking of medical, the medical process quite likely has changed maybe since the last time you've been to see an aviation medical examiner. The FAA now requires, if you're going to see a medical examiner for first, second, third class medical, that you complete your medical application online at FAA Med Express. That's a requirement. You can no longer just go into the office and fill out the paper form. You have to do it ahead of time online, complete an online account to do so. That's all free. You can search FAA Med Express to do. Long term, it is certainly meant and intended to save you some time because all of your information can be saved, and as you go to renew medicals in the future, you'll be able to come back to your exact same information and just make any updates that are necessary. And do keep in mind the requirements, the medical standards for third class, they have not changed in some time, so it is a very basic physical. If you are over the age of 40, that third class medical is still just going to be good for 2 years, whereas if you're under the age of 40, you get a full 5 years now on your medical, the duration of the medical certificate. Special issuance. A lot of us have had maybe events in our life or been taking medication that may not allow for a blanket unrestricted medical certificate. If you believe you fall into that category, I would strongly suggest that you maybe seek out some guidance, do a little research ahead of time. A great resource for that would be the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, AOPA, a lot of great medical resources there, but certainly seek out maybe some guidance from an organization that you know and trust, or read up on some information before you pursue the special issuance class. Find an AME in your area, very easy, just Google aviation medical examiners. The FAA does have a dedicated link where you can search by zip code, you can search by city. Typically there are plenty of options, or should be plenty of options close by. So back to this light sport aircraft thing. So under the light sport aircraft rules, which again is relatively new, you can essentially fly anywhere a private pilot could. You can also, under certain conditions, fly in Class B, C, and D airports. You're also not limited to any distance. Some things that you cannot do under the light sport rules is fly under IFR, fly at night, fly over 10,000 feet, or anytime the visibility is less than 3 miles. And you also are required to have visual contact with the ground. But again, what you are limited to is flying an aircraft that meets the sport pilot requirements. And while there's a variety of categories for light sport, just focused on light sport airplanes for just a second, that is going to be limited to a two-place aircraft, single engine, piston driven, weighs less than 1,320 pounds, and is capable of cruise flight no greater than 120 knots. That's the basic categories. So for those private pilots out there, again, that wish to maybe come back into aviation and not pursue the medical route and just fly under light sport rules, you are absolutely able to do that following those same flight review requirements. You can allow the medical to lapse, but again, an important caveat to that, if you have had a previous medical revoked, denied, or withdrawn, you can't do the self-certifying medical. So a few other things that we've seen big changes in related to aviation in the last several years, even going back a little further than that, is the new technology. And hopefully there's a lot of people out there that will view this newer technology as a real positive. First and foremost, you should never be in a situation or newer technology is being forced upon you. So at any time throughout this process, maybe you're venturing back into aviation, if something is being kind of pushed on you that you're just not comfortable with, that you're not ready to use, this can all be done in steps and phases, and to your comfort level. The great thing about some of this new technology, which includes everything from color moving maps to weather, these portable GPS units, with information that we never dreamed possible in an aircraft, now available in these small portable units. It's really it really does wonders in terms of spatial orientation, access to information. Again, it's meant to be a safety enhancement device. The other positive thing I would say about most of the manufacturers that are involved in some of the technically advanced aircraft that you'll see, glass panel technology that we've talked about, so many wonderful, great online resources that are available for you to become proficient with this technology. Online simulation programs, video-based training, manuals you can typically fly online. But again, this is all meant and intended to make your flying easier and safer. However, how you introduce this type of technology, if at all, certainly dependent upon the individual. So by no means are you required, to take advantage of any of this, but these are some of the things that are new that you could see coming back into aviation. Also, kind of revolutionizing aviation and probably all of our lives has been the iPad, the Apple iPad, which has really been widely accepted in so many applications related to aviation. So much so that the FAA now does permit the use of iPads as what they term a full-blown electronic flight bag, meaning there's no longer a requirement to carry around loads of paper charts in a big flight bag, airport facilities directory, all of those. There's a number of wonderful applications that are out there on the market that replace all of that information that had been previously found on paper. So you're just carrying that all around on one device, and one device that you likely use in kind of your everyday life. So that's been tremendously convenient addition. Some of the apps you may explore if you haven't begun this process already: ForeFlight, WingX, Garmin Pilot, AOPA FlyQ is another one I'll mention, Jeppesen. All of these, flightplan.com, all have wonderful applications that are out there in the App Store for all of you iPad users. My recommendation would be to maybe get some input, seek some advice to some other pilots that are flying out there, see what they like, but also everyone, I believe everyone actually without exception, does offer some form of free trial period with these applications. So when you get to the point when you're looking to possibly introduce the iPad to your flying and look at an application to hold all of your desired information and all of your electronic charts, take several for a test drive. Take them all for a test drive. Download, again, you can typically use for free for at least a 30-day period. Also new to the iPad and part of FAA's next generation has been ADS-B technology, the automatic dependent surveillance broadcast information, which allows you through a portable receiving device to have weather information and other aviation data, NOTAMs, TFRs sent directly to your iPad and overlaid again on some of your favorite applications. One of the industry's leading and most popular now is a device that is available from Sporty's, and it's known as the Stratus ADS-B receiver. Not only does it do all those great things via the for-flight application like hold all your charts, etc., but the Stratus device receives this free government-based ADS-B broadcast. Yes, free, no subscriptions, no XM, none of that, and it feeds that weather information and other aviation information directly into your iPad overlaid in flight. So in terms of investment, it's taken maybe what used to cost tens of thousands of dollars in panel upgrades, and for less than $1,000 you can get all of that information, including traffic, including GPS, including backup attitude, airspeed, altitude information, just like you see in the picture. Really phenomenal. Turning our attention to Airspace, everyone's favorite. Quick review of the Alphabet Airspace. Class A Airspace, excuse me, starts probably not applicable to most of us, including myself out there on the presentation tonight, but this is the airspace above what the sectional chart can see. This is 18,000 feet up to 60,000 feet essentially, not shown on any of the VFR charts, of course. It's limited to IFR traffic only. When you get up into Class A airspace, all the altitudes are based on standard altitude, pressure altitude, with the altimeter set at 2992. You do have to be on an instrument flight plan and possess an instrument rating in order to be up in Class A airspace. Shifting to Class B airspace, the solid blue marking on the sectional chart. Class B airspace generally limited to some of the busiest terminal areas that you'll find in the country. Usually you'll find a radius of about 30 miles, however that can change depending on the specific airspace, because most of these are custom built for the general areas. VFR requirements for flight into Class B are that you do maintain 3 miles of visibility and also stay clear of clouds. You are required to have two-way communication capability, Mode C transponder, and also very important distinction between Class B and the other controlled airspace areas, you do have to receive a specific clearance into Class B while operating under VFR. And there is a speed limit that probably most of us do not need to worry about all that much. Also of note around the Class B airspaces that you'll see is the 30 nautical mile Mode C veil. Probably rings a bell for many of you. This is the airspace surface on up when operating within. Even though you may be outside of the airspace itself, you are required to have a functioning Mode C transponder. Some noted exceptions are if you do happen to be flying an aircraft that was originally certified without an electric system, there is a provision that you can make prior arrangements to still operate. Class C airspace, a little more common, solid magenta, takes up much less of a footprint than the Class B's, usually 5 to 10 nautical mile radius are the general dimensions, up to about 4,000 feet. Also in terms of VFR operations, required to maintain 3 miles of visibility, 1,000 feet above clouds, 500 below, or 2,000 horizontally. Think the 3-1-52 rule. Hopefully you've heard that before. And you must also have the two-way communications established prior to entering, although unlike Class B, you're not required to receive a specific clearance. Class D airspace, the dashed blue, typically about 4 nautical mile radius, 200 knot indicated airspeed speed limit. VFR minimum requirements are at least 3 miles of visibility, the same 3-152 rule, of course, and you also must have two-way radio communications established before entering. Most of the surface Class Ds you'll see house only temporary control towers, meaning well, temporary is not the right word, but control towers that are not open 24 hours a day, like most towers. When the tower facility does close down at a Class D, which again is fairly common, it does revert to Class E airspace down to the surface. Class E airspace, denoted a couple different ways on the sectional. What you're seeing here with the magenta and the gradient is Class E airspace that starts on the lighter side of that shading, 700 feet above the ground level. On the outside of that, 1,200 feet above the ground. Same VFR minimum requirements for flight in Class E airspace of the 3-152 rule. The dashed magenta now is showing what Class E airspace looks like all the way to the surface. You sometimes will find these at maybe slightly busier airports that do have access to some automated weather capability, is where you oftentimes will see the Class E airspace all the way to the surface. And the cloud clearance and visibility requirements, again, all of those options you see there noted on the screen are all the 3-152, 3 mile visibility, 1,000 above, 500 feet below, 2,000 feet horizontal. So that rule of thumb anyway, is a very conservative and safe rule of thumb, and something you could apply to any airspace and maintain a good safety margin, and B, make sure you're remaining legal. Do also remember, as we mentioned, that sport pilots, even though there are some of these classifications of airspace that technically get down to only a mile of visibility to be legal VFR, that does not apply to sport pilots or recreational pilots, which are always required to have visibility of at least 3 miles. Some special use airspace that you often see on sectional charts. There's an example of a military operations area on the left, a lot of military training activity. No requirement to obtain clearance while flying VFR. However, it's certainly a good idea to receive some type of flight following or guidance, and also check on the sectional chart itself for its times of operation, so you can be extra vigilant and alert for other aircraft. An alert area noted on the right. Oftentimes you'll see in areas where there's some specific hazard, for example, high volume of student training activity, which is in the example on the right. Warning areas. Warning areas, same type of hazards that exist in military operations area, only these are located offshore. Also be aware of the symbology of the air defense identification zone, which is noted on the right. Crossing, that kind of denotes the border of the United States, and crossing an ADIZ does require that you be either on an IFR or defense VFR flight plan. Prohibited areas, just as the name implies, prohibited flight activity at all times. Restricted areas, we only restrict flight at certain times. So for operations in restricted area, you must either consult the chart to determine when the areas are actually active, or speak directly via radio communications to the controlling agency for additional details. Also relatively new is the Washington, D.C. Special Flight Rules area. The note here, if you do plan on operating in or around, which has a specific designation on the sectional chart, the Washington, D.C. Special Flight Rules area, you are required to receive specific training. And you are required to have a discrete transponder code, and essentially the point to remember is air traffic control must always be aware of who you are and what you're doing when you're operating in or around the Washington, D.C. airspace. So if you are based in that area or plan on doing any flying, do seek out, which is free online, the required specific training for that airspace. Temporary flight restrictions, TFRs is the acronym, do pop up anywhere at any time and can be on very short notice. Probably the most popular variety we see is when the president or vice president travels, which creates these big zones of airspace that you cannot operate in. So always be aware, checking NOTAMs. The FAA has some good resources out there to take a look at all TFRs that are available in a pictorial format, and many of the new applications for use on your iPad also denote temporary flight restrictions. Also sporting events, all Major League Baseball, all NFL football, all Division I college football that play and occupy stadiums that seat 30,000 or more people also have TFRs that automatically exist over those venues within a 3-mile radius up to 3,000 feet AGL. Those are always in place 1 hour before the start of the event to 1 hour after. Quick review of regulations. If you had an address change, anytime recently or since the last time you flew, there is a regulatory requirement to notify FAA. That's technically required to be done within 30 days. If you've exceeded that, still advise you to do the official address notification. Best way to do that is via the FAA website. Just search FAA change of address. Quick review of your required maintenance inspections. Annual inspection is required on all aircraft every 12 calendar months. The acronym to remember here is Aviate. That's what you might remember back from your primary training. The VOR check every 30 days only applies if you're flying instruments. There is a requirement for an inspection on the aircraft every 100 hours if the aircraft is being operated for hire only. There is a requirement for IFR aircraft to have an altimeter and pedostatic system check. There's a requirement for all aircraft that are required to have an operating transponder to have that transponder checked every 24 months, and all aircraft that are required to be using an ELT, that also has to be inspected every 12 calendar months. Quick review of FAR 91.17 related to alcohol consumption. You do have to have an 8-hour buffer if consuming any alcohol prior to operating an aircraft. You are prohibited from operating an aircraft under the influence or with a blood alcohol content of 0.04% or greater. Also, an important note within this regulation, and often one that's kind of glossed over, is that you are prohibited from operating an aircraft while using or taking any drug that affects the person's faculty in any way contrary to safety. So a lot of this is really not the time of year for it, but in the fall, winter months, when people are taking a lot of cold medication, etc., if you read the fine print on those bottles, oftentimes you'll see that the medication you're taking probably contradicts this regulatory requirement of 91.17. So certainly if you're on any medication, take a moment to review the procedures and take a good hard look and assessment of whether you're good and safe to operate the aircraft. Minimum safe altitudes. Over congested areas, you're required to stay at least 1,000 feet above highest obstacle within 2,000 feet horizontally. Other than congested, that goes down to 500 feet above. The way you tell the difference is looking at the sectional chart. Yellow areas congested, non-yellow shaded areas are other than congested. There's also a provision that allows you in sparsely populated areas or over water to simply operate 500 feet from any person, vehicle, or structure. Before you fly, 91.103, this is what I call the catch-all. So when individuals are searching for the requirement that you check weather, that you check NOTAMs, that you do a thorough pre-flight, 91.103 really applies to all these things. It requires that each pilot in command become familiar with all of the required information, the pre-flight catch-all. Minimum fuel requirements. Always must have at least 30 minutes of fuel reserve for operations in the daytime, at least 45 at night. In my opinion, these are not conservative enough. If you're looking for advice or recommendation, my personal minimum is always at least 1 hour. With that, I'm going to take a pause, and I'm going to turn things over now to David, who is going to take us through a weather review. David, are you with us?
Thanks, Eric. Yes, right here. We'll go ahead and pick right up from there and continue on with our weather review. Although the weather system really hasn't changed much in the United States since the 1997 big regulatory changes, there's still always a couple things we want to keep in mind when we're preparing for getting back out of a period of inactivity in aviation, or perhaps those of you coming back to aviation after several years of inactivity. The big thing with the weather picture, we always want to start in thinking about the surface analysis chart. You want to start with a big picture weather briefing, because this is going to explain why the weather is doing what it is doing. So the first thing I always encourage my students to do is sit down, take a look at the surface analysis chart, turn on the weather channel, pay attention to what's going on with the big picture, the highs, the lows, the cold fronts, the warm fronts, etc. And when you take a look at that, that's going to give us a lot more understanding of the individual smaller picture weather when we take a look at, say, our METARs and TAFs. As Eric was mentioning earlier, we really have seen a tremendous improvement in a lot of the technology that we have available to us. In particular, flight planning has become so much easier than back in my day when we used to use a good old-fashioned paper sectional, put out the plotter, make all your marks, and then get out the grid sheets and use your calculator or your manual E6B and make all your fuel and planning calculations. It used to take me hours to get ready for my cross countries. Nowadays, the apps that we have on the iPad, for example, or the Android tablets, you can literally do that flight planning and all those calculations in a matter of minutes. And once you're really familiar with it, it can even be in under a minute in some cases. So if you're interested in that type of technology and making yourself a little bit more familiar with that, I encourage you to find, as Eric mentioned, the free demos that are online, or consult with a local flight instructor or another pilot to get a chance to see what's out there. Now we'll go straight on in and dive into decoding a METAR and a TAF. Of course, a METAR we're looking at, I have a sample in here for us. A METAR is just an observation. Remember, it's a past tense observational weather. We're not looking at what's happening in the future. We're taking a look at what has already happened. So METARs follow the same basic format. We've selected one here just to review that covers most of the basics. Keep in mind, of course, that METARs do have certain sections that will appear or disappear depending upon the weather phenomena that are happening that day. So this isn't a complete review. If you're looking for a complete review, I highly suggest you take a look at the Aviation Weather Services book that the FAA provides and is available freely on FAA.gov as well. Here we are, we're looking at the airport identifiers, our first data block, followed by the observation time. So in this case, we're looking at the 14th day of the month at 2015 Zulu. The next data block for this one is the auto, just indicating that this is an automated METAR, that a human being was not part of the observation. The next data block is the winds coming out of 260 at 8 knots. If we were to get a gusting factor, you would see a G and then another 2 numbers indicating additional wind gust factor. Our next data block is indicating the visibility, so we're looking at 10 statute miles of visibility here. The METAR system only observes up to 10 statute miles as standard due course. So you're not going to see a 20 or a 30 SM in most cases. You're only going to see the 10 SM. And then, of course, it goes down from there down to, a quarter mile or less in heavy fog. In this particular METAR we're looking at clear skies. The METAR we're looking clear, CLR, actually stands for clear below 12,000 feet. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're not talking about clouds up in the mid-20s or up 30s. We're just talking about clear below 12,000. The next 2 data blocks are dealing with temperature and dew point in Celsius. So we're looking at 22 degrees Celsius as our temperature, with the dew point being -4 degrees Celsius. Just giving us that temperature dew point spread, which is so important if we're looking to find out where there might be the possibility of fog or some heavy haze conditions in some cases. The last data block that we'll look at is our altimeter setting, observed in inches of mercury. The A is your key. That's what I always tell my students, is the A stands for altimeter setting, and that's just going to be 30.07. So that's what we'll be dialing into the Colesman window there in the altimeter to get correct field elevation. In METARs, after that altimeter setting, you'll often see RMK, Romeo Mike Kilo, and then you'll see a whole bunch of additional data blocks. That stands for the remarks section of the METAR, and that's just getting into some finer nitty-gritty items that we're not going to simply cover tonight because that's going to give us just the basics. Moving on into TAFs, our Terminal Area Forecast, TAFs, this is our forecast. So in a TAF system, of course, we're looking for in the future. METARs in the past, TAFs in the future. Same basic format that starts us off, as that is the airport identifier that we're looking at. And here's our, this is the time that the TAF was issued. The issued time was the 14th day of the month at 1720 Zulu. Now, in addition to the issued time, TAFs are also going to go ahead and give us valid periods of time because we're talking about a forecast in the future. Obviously, I can't predict what the weather is going to be in 30 days from now, at least not with any kind of accuracy. We need to be able to confine what time frames we're looking at. So these two data blocks are going to begin the start and stop period of that TAF point. So this reads as the 14th day of the month at 18 Zulu is when the TAF is going to begin. And then we're going to follow that with it's going to end at the 15th day of the month at 18 Zulu. Most of the TAF stations in the United States forecast a 24-hour period of time. So you're normally going to see that same time period like 1418, 1518, for example, 24 hours. There are a few stations, the very large Class B airports, some of those will issue a 30-hour TAF, so you get an extra 6 hours out of those particular TAFs. Same basic wind velocity, once again, winds 220 at 8 knots, coming out of southwest. Now with TAFs, unlike METARs, if the METARs were just going to observe up to 10 statute miles, the TAFs are only going to predict up to 6 statute miles and above. So we're looking at there as P6SM, or what I say is plus 6 statute miles. That's greater than 6 statute miles, 7, 8, 9, 10, whatever the case may be. But the TAF will only go up to P6SM. Very similar to the METAR, when we used to say clear, CLR, and the METAR for clear below 12,000, the TAF has the ability to call for SKC, or skies clear. And that's going to be a pure observation, saying all the way up. That's pure blue skies. The next one is going to be the timeline. Since we started off on that very first data line there was when the TAF began. That first line said, okay, we're going to begin at 18 Zulu. So when is the next time period that I'm concerned with? In this particular TAF, we're looking at the letter FM, or from. So from the 15th day at 0300 Zulu. That's when we're starting the next time period. Since the TAF started on the 14th day at 1800 Zulu, this next line is going to get us at the 15th day of the month at 0300 Zulu. And at that time frame, we're looking at winds are going to be 340 at 9 knots, gusting to 17 knots. There's that G with the additional 2 numbers. Then we're going to look at reduced visibility. Looks like we're down to 3 statute miles visibility with light rain. Now, RA is the precipitation. That's our rain. The minus symbol in front of it indicates light. If there was no symbol there, it would be indicating moderate, and if it was a plus symbol, we'd be indicating heavy. So that one's going to be 3 statute miles with light rain. Next data block there is just going to be a cloud observation. We now have clouds coming in at the broken cloud level at 3,000 feet AGL. So just add 2 more zeros at the end there, and that's your cloud height, or excuse me, cloud bases in AGL. So broken clouds at 3,000. The TAF system, if you're not familiar with it, if it's been since 1997 or it's just been a little while since you've read the TAF directly, remember we're looking at 4 basic levels of clouds. We're looking at few, scattered, broken, and overcast. And those specific definitions can be found once again in the Aviation Weather Services book from the FAA, or it also is back in the AIM section of weather. Next line reads from the 15th day at 1700 Zulu. We're looking at winds coming out of 330 at 12 knots. Thankfully the rain has gone away. We're now looking at better than 6 statute miles. So once again 7, 8, 9, 10, somewhere in that category, looking better. And we're dealing with skies clear. Now the TAF, remember that last line there, it says from 15th day of the month at 1700 Zulu. That TAF is going to end at the 15th day of the month at 1800 Zulu, because that's where the top data line said it's going to start and stop. So from 18 Zulu to 18 Zulu is where we're looking at in that TAF period. So just a real brief weather overview there for METARs and TAFs. There's a lot more discriminators and weather phenomena codes out there, so please understand that's not a complete observation out there. For weather briefing sources, of course, we still have good old flight service. Lockheed Martin Flight Service is great service, 1-800-WX-BRIEF to get a telephone call for weather briefing. But for those of you who have a computer, a little more computer savvy and like doing your weather briefings on your own time, I'd like to recommend that you try aviationweather.gov. This is the official NOAA, National Weather Service observation system for aviation weather, and has a tremendous number of resources. Everything from, of course, the surface analysis charts, the big picture we were talking about, down into those METARs and TAFs, winds aloft, airmets, sigmets, you name it. All the major weather products are there, including some experimental weather products, which if you've never seen them before, can really give some insight into icing conditions, turbulence conditions. There's a lot of neat stuff they're able to predict these days. If you're making that conversion to iPad or Android tablets or other aviation-based apps, get to know your individual app, because almost every app on the market integrates weather and weather briefings into its basic functionality. This right here is just a quick snapshot of the ForeFlight application, and ForeFlight was originally started as a weather briefing app, and has obviously expanded a lot more beyond that, and just has a tremendous number of resources for weather, including for those of you in the audience there that don't particularly love decoding those METARs and TAFs. You can see right here, here's a screenshot of a METAR for an airport that was dealing with, as we zoom in there a little bit there, 3 statute miles with heavy rain and thunderstorms. Clearly not a good day there at Lake Charles. But if you take a look down a little below that, it automatically decodes that information for you. It's going to go ahead and say heavy thunderstorms and rain. So that's kind of a really nice feature. They go ahead and decode that for you. But as I am a flight instructor, I will make the disclaimer that you should continue to read that in encoded just to keep your proficiency in the METAR and TAF language. Going beyond basic observations, METARs and TAFs, we do of course have other forecast and warning systems out there, including SIGMETs, which come in 2 different varieties. We have convective SIGMETs and non-convective SIGMETs. Convective SIGMETs, of course, are dealing with convective activity such as thunderstorms, for example. Most of the aircraft and all of this audience that we're talking about are probably going to want to try to avoid SIGMETs of any variety, because that stands for significant meteorological information. So convective, going to be the thunderstorms. Non-convective, we're looking at severe conditions like severe icing, severe turbulence. These are the type of things that general aviation aircraft really don't, really any aircraft of that size for that matter, really aren't capable of handling. And then in the next category we have airmets. Airmets, or now we're dealing with more the light to moderate type conditions. So they come in 3 varieties: Sierra, Tango, and Zulu in the formal formats there. Sierra dealing with IFR conditions, or mountain obscuration, so forecasting large areas of low-lying clouds. Tango dealing with moderate turbulence and or surface winds greater than 30 knots. And Zulu indicating moderate icing conditions. It also, in the AirMet Zulu, also gives freezing level forecasts, so you get a chance to know where that icing might begin. Beyond that, the National Weather Service now also makes specific icing forecasts themselves in addition to the airmets. It was originally an experimental product on aviationweather.gov and is now an officially approved product, whereby you get a chance to see a graphical representation of areas of icing intensity as well as icing probability. And if you've never checked this product out, go to that aviationweather.gov or take a look at your particular app, because most of them have it integrated. At least I know the ForeFlight app does in Garmin. And get a chance to take a look at that. Now, of course, for most of us in the country, we're slowly starting to get out of the icing season, thankfully. But if you haven't looked at it, it's a tremendous amount of resource information there. Area forecasts, FAs, are still around, still very useful, especially if you're trying to look for cloud tops. One of the few products out there that still predict cloud tops in general areas. So a lot of information, along with giving you a forecast area for airports that are not otherwise served by a TAF. Winds aloft forecast, still best information for trying to extrapolate wind information for making that time, fuel, distance calculations for your cross-country flying. In addition to the aviationweather.gov website, there are a lot of other flight planning tools that are available on the internet. For example, flightplan.com. Now all these websites we're listing here are all free. But flightplan.com, for example, is a service whereby you get a chance to file your Lockheed Martin Flight Service flight plans directly from an internet provider, and in addition to filing your flight plan for you, has a tremendous amount of planning tools, really sophisticated algorithms, and being able to calculate time, fuel, distance, of course, and then arrival and departure times based upon weather information, specifically the winds. Just a great service. I use it all the time myself. In addition, AOPA's Airport Directory, which if you're an AOPA member, we all used to get those in the big books once a year. That has all gone digital now. You can get it straight from AOPA's website. And if you're not an AOPA member, you can also go to airnav.com. Has a tremendous airport directory and some fuel price information for those of you looking to try to get the best fuel price in your area. VFRmap.com is a digital charting service along with SkyVector. Those two companies there do a digital charting service. So you can take a look at the current charts for an area that perhaps you're not very familiar with, or you just simply wanted to plan a long distance flight and you don't yet have that sectional chart with you. Speaking of weather and en route, Eric had originally referenced to some of the newer technologies with ADS-B out there, but not to be forgotten is the simple flight service call over the radio. Flight service is still a fantastic opportunity to be able to get en route weather briefings, file your flight plan over the radio if you need to do so, activate and close your flight plan, which is really a great recommendation for safety as well as for flight tracking information, along with TFRs and special use airspace status, such as the restricted airspace that Eric was referencing to earlier. You can also get and receive PIREPs, which if you haven't filed a flight plan recently or anytime soon over the phone, you're always going to hear the same thing, that pilot reports are being requested. Pilot reports are still the best observation tools that forecasters have to see what's going on out there, and we are the best observers of that information out there in flight. You can also update your flight plan ETA, you can make changes, and of course flight service is also there in case of an emergency. They can really help out. The two images we have there are just some charting reminders. The image over on your right there, Leesburg radio there at 122.2 or 122.6 are both remote communication outlet frequencies, RCOs, for Leesburg radio and flight service. So if you were to pick up the radio and give them a call on either one of those frequencies, use the term Leesburg radio, give them your tail number, your approximate location, and they'll get back to you. In the bottom left-hand corner, though, we have the more the older style VOR data block, which is still very prevalent across the country, whereby you have to tune one radio and talk on that one and then listen on a different radio. And this one is always an element of confusion because it's not the most logical thing that they put on the chart. But as you can see there, we're looking at the Oceanside VOR. It's San Diego radio is who we'd be talking to. It's San Diego Flight Service. That's the block underneath. And we would tune our transmit communication radios on 122.1. That's our communication frequency. And we're going to transmit on 122.1, and flight service is going to receive on 122.1. So that's what that R stands for, is flight service will receive on that frequency. And then we and the pilot, we're going to go ahead and tune in 115.3, tune that into your nav radio side, turn on your audio panel and tune up the VOR, and then you're going to hear flight service talk over top of the VOR frequency at 115.3. So that one's an element of confusion. 122.1 you transmit, 115.3 you receive. If you're not familiar with flight following, you probably heard the term before, but maybe you don't use it that often. Just want to clarify for those of you what that is. That's a free VFR radar advisory service. That's where ATC is going to follow along, literally tracking your movements on the radar screen. They're not going to be giving you instructions on which way to go. It's not like an IFR flight plan, but they're just getting another set of eyes. This is really helpful in congested airspace where you're dealing with a lot of traffic targets, especially if you're going over long distances, where sometimes our traffic scanning techniques perhaps get a little complacent. It's helpful to obviously keep an eye around for terrain or other obstacles, and it's always nice to be in touch with ATC in the event that you did need some kind of assistance. They're already on the radio, they already know who you are. If you do want to participate with flight following, of course it's all voluntary. You do need a working transponder because ATC is going to need to follow along your specific target. They need to know who you are. Then you're going to contact the whatever controlling center that you're with for air traffic control, and you're going to request flight following services. They're going to ask what type of aircraft you are, they're going to ask what altitudes you're interested in, and they're going to ask, of course, what your destination or route of flight is. Now, ATC only have to provide that workload permitting. They don't have to do flight following for you, but most air traffic controllers, if they have the time, are happy to do so, as they know it helps us pilots and it allows them to track their traffic a little bit more accurately. Radar services, as a big disclaimer at the bottom there, do not relieve us as pilots of the responsibility to see and avoid. Collision avoidance is still always our responsibility, even if we're receiving flight following services. And with that, I want to kind of carry right over into radio communications and traffic patterns. Most of us are probably all familiar with VASIs. If you're not familiar with PAPIs, I went ahead and put this here for you. It's precision approach path indicators. Work very, very similar to a VASIs do. They're coming a lot more prevalent these days at most airports. It's a 4-light system in most cases, whereby we're dealing with just a slight bit more precision on that high or low indication. Of course, we have all whites, you're too high. If we're dealing with equal amounts of red and white, we're all right. And if we're reds and reds, you'll soon be dead. Those are the old expressions to kind of help people remember. But as the graphic shows there, you're also dealing with a subtle change in between each one of the extremes there, unlike the VASIs where we're just dealing with those 3. Runway incursions are a big topic for the FAA and have been for about the last 10 years. If you receive any of the FAA safety emails from FAAsafety.gov, you'll see that runway incursions is a very large topic. And if you're not familiar with the term, it's one that we definitely weren't throwing around 15, 20 years ago very often. It's just simply that when an aircraft, a vehicle, or some piece of equipment gets onto an active runway in such a way that it's going to create an issue, a potential hazard. Whereby, you know, a truck pulls out onto an active runway when an airplane's getting ready to land. That would be a runway incursion. And the best thing you can do to prevent that runway incursion is simply know where you are at all times, keep your situational awareness about you, know what the runway and taxiway signs around you mean, and if you're looking for a great review there are color reprints in the AIM. If you don't have a current version of the AIM, I highly recommend that you get one. You can go on the FAA website. They do have one online, or the book formats are normally around $10. You can buy the whole FAR AIM combined. Knowing where those signs are, knowing where you are, is the best way to get yourself out of trouble, or prevent yourself, rather, from getting there in the first place. Speaking of trying to keep your airplane out of trouble, it's always a good idea to use the lighting on your aircraft as another layer to try to keep you visible to other aircraft. As some general rules of thumb, here's some just catches, things you should try to be using in your aircraft. These are the ones we use here at Sporty's Academy. If the engine's about to be running or is currently running, the rotating beacon should always be on. That's an easy indicator to anybody around that the engine is about to start or is currently turning. If you're going to cross a runway, You want to turn on all those exterior lights because you're obviously trying to see and avoid. You want to make sure everybody sees you before you go across the runway. When you're entering the departure runway, you want to turn on all those lights except the landing lights, unless you need that landing light to be able to see where you're going. And then once you begin the actual takeoff run, go ahead and flip that landing light on, and that gives that clue that you're now beginning to move. I talked a little earlier about collision avoidance and long cross-country flights and our complacency, but remember that collision avoidance is always our responsibility as a pilot in command. At non-towered airports and while you're en route, that traffic collision avoidance is solely us. The pilot in command is the only one doing that. At the towered airports, of course, we have air traffic control is going to help us out with their radar, but at the end of the day, it is just us as the pilot in command that are solely responsible. Collision avoidance scanning techniques, this hasn't changed, still the same book mantra. You want to scan in a systematic pattern, left to right or right to left, in 10-degree increments to hopefully be able to increase the possibility of spotting that traffic, and be very cognizant of where your aircraft and your particular blind spots might be. If you're dealing with a high wing, of course, you're looking for above the wings on either side, or obviously large blind spots, and low wing, of course, is that descending scenario. It's always when you're trying to avoid that. Collision avoidance, some simple good tactics you should be doing. You want to make sure and use your radio whenever possible. Announce your position at an incoming airport at least 10 miles out, and then you want to announce each key point in the pattern. The unfortunate thing is not everybody uses a radio, or maybe they don't have a radio. For example, I fly an aircraft that does not have an electrical system, even though I do carry a handheld. You can't always expect everyone else to be on the radio at the same time, so keep that vigilance in the traffic scanning. In your traffic patterns, here's just basic review of the different traffic pattern legs and the standard pattern entry. It's often confused. A lot of people have their own methods of how to enter the traffic pattern. We're specifically looking, in most cases, for the 45-degree to the downwind leg as an entry. And then for departures, there are only two that are officially listed in the AIM as a straight-out departure or the 45-degree departure that you see there on the screen. Two alternative pattern entries that we kind of adopt at Sporty's Academy are the midfield crosswinds. And then most people find two basic options. You can do a midfield crosswind at above 500 feet above the traffic pattern, circle around, descend, and then enter in on that 45. Or if the traffic is light and you want to be at pattern altitude, you can cross the midfield and then simply merge with the downwind. But keep in mind that you need to yield to the other traffic because they are more in line. The old term of position and hold, if you're familiar with the position and hold command, it is now line up and wait. As an official ICAO change, so ATC will no longer tell you to position and hold. They will now use the term line up and wait. It means the same thing. And as a good recommendation, you should only be doing line up and wait at tower controlled airports, because if you line up and wait on a non-towered airport, the likelihood is your aircraft you can't see behind you on final. So that kind of wraps up most of our important big key concepts for the rusty pilot perspective. Now that you're back, what are some things you can do to continue to stay active? So flying clubs, of course, are making a great resurgence here in the United States. AOPA is doing a very good job of promoting flying clubs. Local airports are really starting to take it back again. Take a look in your area to see if there's a flying club that maybe has popped up that you're not familiar with, as there are great options and alternatives for saving a few dollars on your flying expenses, as well as creating a social network for you to be with other pilots to help encourage you to stay current. For those of you like charity or volunteer flying, there are so many different organizations out there that are looking for pilots just like you to help people get around. The lists are so long I can't even list them all, but take a look online, you'll find them. EAA chapters, the Experimental Aircraft Association, along with Women in Aviation International, those chapters are also very prevalent in most airports. And then the good old-fashioned fly out or fly in. Always a great time. At Sporty's, we try to get a couple aircraft together a couple times a month to get a chance to fly out to breakfast. It's one of our things we enjoy doing. As you're getting back in the left seat, remember some of the things we were talking about tonight. Aviation apps are the wave. There's so much information out there. It's very easy to get a hold of, and the amount of information in that tablet in your hand on those websites is going to impress you if you're not familiar with them already. OPA has kept up with the times, and they have a tremendous number of website resources along with their own dedicated apps. And we'd like to make 2 plugs for iPadPilotNews.com. If you're an iPad user and you're not familiar with iPad Pilot News, check it out. It's a free resource, has webinars, good to-dos, information about training with your iPad and unlocking some of those features that you may or may not know about. Along with learntoflyhere.com, great blog system there. A lot of different pilots contribute to that, along with talking about topics about staying current or beginning to learn how to fly, or just hearing some stories about how other people keep current on their own self. And with that, we'll turn the floor back over to Eric to say what questions might have popped up during the point of the presentation.
David, thanks a lot. A lot of great information there. Let me start with maybe clarifying a topic that I began with earlier, and David, jump in here. Feel free to contribute as you wish, but it seems though there may be a little confusion sorting out the difference between getting current for sport pilot privileges versus, for example, private pilot privileges. So one point I want to make perfectly clear is that there's not a distinction in terms of flight review. A flight review is a flight review. Now, it's possible an instructor may tailor a flight review slightly different for someone who is seeking private pilot privileges versus sport pilot privileges, so you want to know that ahead of it. But in order to get current, no matter which path you are choosing, you must complete a flight review. The second step to getting current is determining or not whether you need a medical certification. If you intend to just fly using sport pilot privileges, a formal FAA medical is not required. If you still intend to utilize private pilot privileges, you would have to then go down the path of medical. Now, David, let me pose a question to you. If you could, not a kind of maybe a black and white answer here, but there's some questions about what to be expected in a flight review, especially for some of the folks that have been away for quite some time. What should they expect that an instructor is going to lead them through, or what maneuvers might they be asked to perform in a flight review?
You know, that's a really great question, because as we pointed out, a flight review is going to be a different thing for different people. What you should normally expect from your flight instructor, first and foremost, is a very brief conversation at the beginning of your flight review, outlining your previous experience and talking about what it is that you do with your regular flying. The flight instructor's goal is to take that flight review and make it meaningful to you. So if you're a local area pilot, we want to focus on local area topics. If you do a lot of cross countries, we're going to focus a little bit more on the weather regulations, that kind of thing. As far as the maneuvers are concerned, the regulations do not specifically require the flight instructor to do any particular set of maneuvers. But as a general rule of thumb, I would suggest that you would expect and be familiar with maybe going back through some slow flight, maybe a stall or two, maybe a steep turn if you feel like those. But for sure, you want to make sure and be able to review normal and abnormal landings, along with normal, abnormal, and emergency procedures for the aircrafts that you fly.
David, thank you very much. Another question, actually, I will pose back to you as well. In terms of medical, classes of medical, could you give us a quick recap on the durations? There was some question about what occurs, for example, if you possess a second class medical, what happens at the end of year 2, whether you can still use that medical or whether you have to go get a brand new one.
Sure. Well, that's going to be dependent upon the medical certificate holder's age. That's a big piece, because the FAA made a distinction there between above age 40 and below age 40. If we're dealing with the second class medicals, for example, and we're dealing with going beyond the 2-year reference we're talking about, or let me just back up maybe a little bit. If we're dealing with above 40 and you're a class 1 or a class 2 medical, after your first or second class medical privileges have exceeded, it then will drop down to third class medical privileges. But remember that above 40, your third class medical will not be good for beyond 24 calendar months from the original date of the examination. Sometimes there's confusion as to people think that it gets additive. It's not. You're dealing with a cumulative amount of months there. So if you're dealing with the individual time periods, know that above 40, no matter what class you're getting at, it's not going to be beyond 24 calendar months. Now, if you're below the age of 40, and we're dropping out of first or second class privileges down into those third class privileges, you have those third class privileges up to 5 years, up to 60 calendar months. But remember, that's cumulative from the original date of the medical, not to be consumed as additive.
David, thanks for that clarification. The other thing I'll point out related to the ages, the age has to do with when you take the medical exam. So on the date when you take that medical exam, if you are under the age of 40, you have your 60 calendar months, 5 years duration. If you are 40 or above on the date of examination, you're down to the 24 months. And again, as David pointed out, that's certainly cumulative. David, could you clarify the difference, or why you would want in the related to VFR flight following? How does that differ from a VFR flight plan?
Oh, excellent, excellent question. The VFR flight plan is really an action that's only going in with flight service. Lockheed Martin Flight Service will open and close those VFR flight plans for you, and that flight plan is only being used for the purposes of search and rescue. If you were to be overdue on your flight plan, then Lockheed Martin would then initiate the actions looking for an overdue aircraft, and it's really used as a safety item as far as going overdue or not being found. Now, flight following, on the other hand, is really, like we mentioned, is another pair of eyes, predominantly used for traffic collision avoidance while you're doing a cross-country or local area maneuvering. It does not have that flight plan feature in terms of a specific overdue aircraft. But that being said, if you drop off the ATC radar unexpectedly, they will begin initiating a lost aircraft procedure as well.
David, thanks for that. With that, we're going to kind of bring an end to the questions. I know we're a little bit over the time period. Thanks to all of you who have certainly stayed with us for the duration. As a quick reminder, this webinar presentation in its entirety, all of the slides, etc., everything we've said, even the question answer, has been recorded, and we do intend to make that available and live on our website free of charge. You can access it as much as you'd like in the next few days. You can check back sportys.com/webinars to view. We would certainly very much appreciate you having you back for a future presentation. Our next scheduled free webinar is coming up on April 30th, and that's on weather flying. So again, another great topic going into the spring flying season. We will have a very short survey that you will be given the option to complete at the conclusion of the presentation, 5 short questions. We're always looking to see what topics might be of interest, so we'd appreciate just a couple minutes of your time if you could possibly complete that. One other quick note, if you happen to be attending the big Sun and Fun Flying in Lakeland, Florida, which is the week of April 22nd, coming up just around the corner, week of April 20th, excuse me. Sporties will be there, a very large presence. I will be there personally, as will David. We'd certainly look forward to meeting you in person and answering any follow-up questions you may have. With that, on behalf of David and the entire Sporty team, again, my name's Eric, and we certainly appreciate you joining us this evening, and have a great night. Safe flying.